The desert didn't care for white dresses. It tore at lace with the same wind that stripped bark from dead mesquite trees, ground silk against dust until it dulled like bone, and scattered rose petals until they were nothing but pale ghosts in the sand. She stood there. In that vast and merciless emptiness, her veil caught on a thorn bush, her shoes sinking into the powder of the road. The last trail of the carriage, her carriage, was fading under the wind. Even the sound of its wheels had vanished, swallowed by the horizon. All that remained was the dull roar of the desert air and the hammering of her own heart. Rebecca Mays had never imagined that silence could be so loud. Just minutes before, she'd been a bride, radiant, trembling, hopeful. Now she was a woman left behind in the middle of nowhere, her wedding gown already dust-streaked, her lips dry, her throat raw from shouting a name that no longer belonged to her. "Henry!" she cried again, though her voice broke halfway through. "Henry, come back!" The only answer was the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the long, unbroken horizon that stretched like a cruel mirror of forever. For a while she just stood there, one gloved hand pressed against her chest, feeling the fast, shallow rhythm of her heartbeat. It was disbelief more than fear that kept her frozen. How could a man drive away from his own wedding carriage, leave the church, the ring, the vows, and simply vanish into the desert? How could love turn to abandonment in the span of a breath? The lace on her sleeve fluttered in the wind. The sun pressed against her skin like a hot iron. When she turned, she saw nothing but the same rolling dunes and scattered stones, the same emptiness in every direction. Then she began to walk. Each step tore the hem of her dress a little more. The once pristine white fabric dragged through thorns and grit, streaking with dirt and sweat. Her bouquet had been lost miles ago. She didn't even notice when it slipped from her hand. Her shoes, dainty and new, had no place on this road. By the time the sun began to slide lower, one heel had snapped clean off. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. The dry air clawed at her lungs. Her voice was gone, her throat raw. Somewhere deep inside, the fear began to bloom. Not the sudden kind that makes you scream, but the slow, suffocating kind that grows heavier with every step. The horizon shimmered with heat. Mirage or not, she kept walking toward it. It was some time between the dying gold of afternoon and the first bruise of dusk when the silence broke. At first, she thought it was thunder, a low, distant rumble that came and went. Then she heard it again, rhythmic, deliberate, alive. Hooves. Rebecca turned, her eyes stinging from dust and sun. Far away, a dark shape moved against the dying light, a man on horseback heading her way. For a moment, hope rose like water in her chest. Then caution crept in behind it. Out here, not every rider was salvation. The figure drew closer, a tall man, coat flapping against the wind, hat brim low. His horse was lean and dust-covered, its gait steady but tired. He slowed as he approached, studying her with the wary patience of someone who had learned not to trust what the desert offered too easily. When he stopped, the silence between them was thick enough to cut. "You lost, ma'am." His voice was deep, rough and steady, like gravel over leather. Rebecca tried to speak, but the words cracked before they left her lips. She swallowed, wiped the back of her hand against her mouth, and tried again. My husband, he..." She looked back toward the empty road. "He left me. He took the carriage, and he's gone." The man's eyes narrowed slightly beneath the shadow of his hat. He didn't speak at first, only looked at her, at the torn dress, the dirt-streaked cheeks, the tremble in her hands. Then he dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face worn by years of sun and dust. A rifle was slung across his saddle, a revolver on his hip. His boots were cracked and sun-bleached. "Left you?" he repeated quietly. "Out here?" Rebecca nodded. The word barely made it past her lips. He exhaled, looked out toward the horizon as if expecting to see a carriage wheel glinting in the distance. Nothing moved. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of dry sage and loneliness. "Name's Colt Avery," he said finally. "You're a long way from anywhere, Mrs. Mays," she whispered. "Rebecca Mays." He nodded once, thoughtful. "You got water?" She shook her head. He reached for his canteen, unscrewed the cap, and handed it over. "Small sips. You drink too much too fast, you'll make yourself sick." Her fingers brushed his as she took it. The metal was warm from the sun, but the water inside felt like life itself. She drank carefully, fighting the urge to gulp. When she handed it back, their eyes met for a moment. just long enough for him to see the gratitude beneath her exhaustion. "You from the east?" he asked. "Boston," she said faintly. "We were to start a new life out here." Henry said there was land, opportunity. Colt's mouth tightened slightly, not quite a smile, not quite pity. "Out here, folks promise a lot of things the land don't care to give." Rebecca looked down at the dirt-stained folds of her dress. "What should I do?" He glanced at the fading sun. "You'll camp here tonight. Can't ride in the dark, not without water or light. There's a dry creek bed a half-mile west, shade, maybe a bit of windbreak." She hesitated. "And you?" "I'll see you there," he said simply. "Ain't safe to be alone out here, not tonight." Something in his tone, calm, unflinching, cut through her fear. She nodded, too tired to argue. As he led his horse westward, Rebecca followed slowly, the remains of her wedding dress trailing behind her like a ghost of a life that had vanished in the span of an afternoon. Somewhere behind them, the wind swallowed her footprints. Ahead, the desert stretched on, endless, unforgiving, waiting. The creek bed was nothing more than a scar in the land, a dry ribbon of cracked clay and scattered stones, where once, long ago, water might have run. Now it offered only shadow and silence, but out here even that was mercy. Colt dismounted and tied his horse to a mesquite limb that barely had life in it. He worked quietly, the way men did who had spent years listening more than talking. Rebecca stood a few steps away, the hem of her dress stirring with the evening wind, her hands twisting together unconsciously. The desert was beginning to cool. The day's furnace heat bled away, leaving the kind of chill that crawled up your sleeves and made your bones remember they were mortal. Colt gathered brush, dry roots, and the brittle bones of old tumbleweeds. When he struck his flint, sparks jumped, and the faintest thread of smoke curled upward before catching. A small, careful fire was born, and no bigger than his hat brim. Rebecca knelt near it, pulling her dress close. The firelight turned the white fabric to gold, flickering like a lantern behind gauze. For the first time, she saw the man clearly. His face was weathered, but not cruel. His eyes carried the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much of life and never asking it to explain itself. "You ride alone?" she asked softly. "Most times." He poked at the fire, sending sparks into the dark. "Ain't many who keep company with me long," she hesitated. "Because you prefer it that way?" He gave a low, humorless chuckle. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just the way it turns out." The silence after that was easy. The kind of silence that fills a space without suffocating it. Rebecca unpinned her veil. It came free in her hands, torn and dusted with sand. She stared at it for a moment, then folded it neatly and laid it beside her. "I used to think this meant something," she said, her voice distant. "Purity, promise, a new life." Colt didn't answer. He let the fire speak instead, the slow crackle, the pop of sap in the wood. She looked up. "Do you think it's wrong what I did? Believing him?" Colt's eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "Trust ain't a sin, ma'am, but it'll sure make a fool of you if you give it to the wrong man." Rebecca drew her knees close and wrapped her arms around them. The firelight painted her face in warm tones, but her eyes still looked cold. Not from the night, but from the emptiness left behind. "He said we'd start fresh, build something together. I didn't even ask where. I just believed." Colt leaned back on his hands, watching the fire. "I reckon he believed it too for a while. Some folks want something till they get close enough to touch it. Then they find out it's heavier than they thought." She nodded faintly, though she didn't really understand. Her gaze drifted to the canteen beside him. "May I?" He handed it over. "Small sips," he reminded her. She drank and passed it back. For a moment, their fingers brushed again. The kind of contact that says nothing but carries too much meaning anyway. Above them, the stars began to show. First a few, then 100, then 1,000. The desert sky was mercilessly honest. There were no walls, no lamps, no roofs to keep the truth out. "You ever been married, Mr. Avery?" she asked suddenly. He was quiet for a long while. The wind sighed through the dry grass before he finally said, "Once." Rebecca turned toward him. "What happened?" He tossed another stick into the fire. "She died. Fever took her the same year I came home from the war." "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shrugged slightly. "It was a long time ago. World don't stop spinning for grief. Just makes a little more dust." She studied him in the flickering light. The stubble on his jaw, the faint scar along his cheek, the way his eyes softened when he spoke of the past even though his mouth didn't change. There was something steady about him, something that felt like the first real thing she'd seen in days. The fire burned low. Coyotes sang in the distance, their cries threading through the silence like a lament. Rebecca lay down a few feet from the flames, her head resting on her arm. The night air was cool against her skin and exhaustion pressed heavy on her eyelids. She looked at the man who had found her, a stranger yet the only anchor in this endless sea of sand. "Mr. Avery?" she murmured. "Yeah? Thank you. For stopping." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Didn't do much. You stopped," she said simply. "That's more than anyone else did today." He said nothing after that. She closed her eyes and drifted into uneasy sleep. Colt sat there listening to the fire crackle, the night stretch, and the faint breathing of the woman beside it. The desert had a way of testing a man's solitude, showing him what kind of company he really kept when no one else was around. He looked out toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, a coward in a suit of dust and guilt was still running. Colt could almost see him, reins clutched tight, fear thick as sweat on his back. "Coward," he muttered under his breath. The stars wheeled slow and patient above him. By the time the fire burned down to embers, Colt had made a quiet decision, one he didn't yet understand himself. When morning came, he'd see the lady safe to town. After that, maybe he'd find the man who left her to die. The first light of morning crawled across the desert like a slow fire. Pale gold touched the tips of the mesquite trees, turned the dry sand into rippling metal, and found the two figures sleeping near the ashes of a spent fire. The air was still cool, but the promise of heat already lay heavy in it. Colt Avery stirred first. Years of riding alone had taught him to wake with the light, and lighter than most men breathed. He sat up slowly, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and reached for his hat resting crown down beside him. His horse lifted its head, ears flicking at some distant sound only animals and men who lived too long in the wild could hear. Rebecca was still asleep, curled beneath her torn wedding dress like a child trying to hide from the world. Her veil had slipped aside, her hair undone from the pins that once held it neat and proper. Strands of it caught the sunlight, pale gold, tangled and free, no longer bound by ceremony or hope. For a long moment, Colt just looked at her. Not out of pity, not out of desire, just the quiet recognition of another soul who'd been broken somewhere behind the eyes. He saw that look often in saloon mirrors and the faces of men who'd lost too much and said too little about it. He rose, stretched, and walked to his saddlebag. The canteen felt light when he lifted it. He frowned. A day's ride, maybe less, before they'd be dry. The nearest town, Stillwater, was 40 miles north if memory served. Maybe more. Behind him, Rebecca stirred. She blinked against the glare, confusion flickering before the memory of yesterday returned like a blow. She sat up fast, clutching her torn dress to her chest as if modesty still had a place out here. "Morning," Colt said. His voice was calm, low, and patient, the kind that didn't rush or ask for answers. She nodded faintly. "I thought it was a dream." "Most bad things start out that way," he said, tightening the cinch on his horse. "You sleep any?" "A little." Her voice cracked with dryness. He handed her the canteen. "Half a swallow, no more," she obeyed. The water tasted of tin and dust, but it steadied her. When she looked up, she saw the horse, a sturdy bay with intelligent eyes and a black mane whipped by the wind. "What's his name?" "Ransom," Colt said. "He don't take kindly to strangers." She smiled faintly. "Neither do you, I think." He glanced over, the corner of his mouth twitching just enough to almost be a smile. Maybe not, they packed in silence. There wasn't much to carry. His gear, her dress, and a handful of hopes too small to name. Before mounting, Colt handed her an old wool coat from his saddlebag. "Sun'll cut you to ribbons if you ride bare like that." She took it hesitantly. "Thank you." The sleeves were too long. The shoulders hung loose. Still, when she wrapped it around herself, she felt something strange. A sense of safety she hadn't known since before the carriage wheels turned away. Colt swung into the saddle and reached a hand down. "Best we move before the heat does." She hesitated, staring at his hand, then placed hers in it. His grip was firm and sure. He lifted her behind him, and she settled awkwardly against the worn leather, clutching the back of his coat as Ransom started forward. The desert stretched before them, endless, unforgiving, shimmering in morning light. Wind carved small spirals in the sand. The sun climbed slow but steady, and with every mile the world grew hotter, brighter and quieter. For a long while neither spoke. Only the sound of hooves and wind filled the space between them. After an hour, Rebecca broke the silence. "Mr. Avery?" "Colt's fine." "Colt, then. Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. "Because no one else would." "That's not much of a reason." "It's enough," he said. "I seen what happens to folks who get left behind in places like this. Figured you didn't deserve to be one of them." She lowered her gaze, fingers tightening on his coat. "Thank you." The trail dipped between two low ridges where old rock jutted from the earth like broken bones. A wind funneled through, bringing the smell of sage and dust and something else. Colt slowed Ransom, his posture shifting. "Hold on. What is it?" He raised a hand for silence. The wind carried faint echoes, grew metallic, distant. Then came the unmistakable sound of laughter. Harsh. Male. "Riders," he muttered. Fear flickered in her eyes. "Bandits?" "Maybe. Maybe worse." He guided Ransom off the trail down into the shadow of the ridge. They waited as two men on horses rode by above, their voices carried by the wind. They were drunk or near enough, one singing, one cursing. Dust rose behind them like ghosts. Rebecca held her breath until they were gone. Colt watched the trail for a long minute, then exhaled slowly. "Road's bad company these days," he said quietly. "You stick close to me, you might just stay breathing." She nodded, still pale. "Do they come this way often?" "Often enough." He nudged Ransom forward again. "Don't worry, they didn't see us." Hours passed. The sun grew merciless, baking the land and everything on it. Rebecca's head drooped with exhaustion. Her arms trembled from holding on. Colt felt her weight shift and slowed the horse to a walk. "We'll rest soon," he said. "There's a watering hole about 5 miles ahead, least there used to be." She didn't answer. He glanced back. Her eyes were half closed, her skin too pale. "Rebecca." She stirred weakly. "I'm all right. Just tired." He stopped the horse, swung down, and helped her off. She swayed on her feet, then leaned against the saddle. Colt handed her the canteen again. "Slow," he warned. When she'd drunk, he tore a strip from his shirt sleeve and dipped it, pressing it to her forehead. She flinched, then sighed, and a sound half relief, half shame. "I'm not built for this," she murmured. "Few are," he said. "Desert don't care who you are, long as you respect it." She looked up at him then. Really looked. The sweat, the dust, the tiredness carved deep into his face. All of it spoke of a man who'd fought the land and learned to live with its cruelty rather than curse it. For the first time, she felt something other than fear. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was the beginning of trust. When they mounted again, she didn't just cling to stay on. She held on because she wanted to. The desert stretched before them, merciless and magnificent. The horizon shimmered like a promise neither dared to speak aloud. Somewhere behind them, the wind erased the last trace of her wedding tracks, the final evidence of the life she'd been abandoned to die in. Ahead lay nothing certain. Yet for the first time since the carriage vanished, Rebecca Mays felt she wasn't walking toward nothing anymore. She was being led, and the man leading her, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, felt the same. By noon, the desert had turned mean. The air shimmered like molten glass, swallowing the horizon until it bent and danced in the heat. The land had no mercy, only endless ridges of sand, patches of cracked clay, and the low whisper of wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ransom's hooves sank deeper with each step. Colt could feel the strain in the horse's breathing, the rhythm of its gait faltering under the weight of heat and distance. Rebecca sat behind him quiet, her hands clutching his coat but her strength fading hour by hour. "You holding on?" Colt asked without turning. She nodded weakly. "Yes, I think so. Don't think no," he said. "Out here doubt'll kill you quicker than thirst." Her lips parted, but no words came. The sun had stolen her voice. Sweat carved trails through the dust on her cheeks. Her wedding dress, once white, then tan, was now the color of the land itself. She looked less like a bride and more like a ghost the desert had decided to keep. Colt's eyes scanned the distance. A shimmer on the horizon drew his attention, a flicker of movement, then nothing. Mirage, maybe, or trouble. They reached the old watering hole by mid-afternoon. What had once been a pond was now nothing more than a cracked basin, ringed by brittle grass. Colt cursed under his breath. Rebecca slid down from the saddle, swaying as she stood. "There's no water?" Not unless you can drink sand, he said. She sank to her knees, exhaustion finally breaking through. Her fingers dug into the dry soil as if she could pull life from it. I can't do this, Colt knelt beside her. You can, he said firmly. And you will, her eyes lifted to his. There was anger there, small but fierce. You don't know what I've lost, he met her gaze. Maybe not, but I know what happens if you quit. He took her hands, dirt and all, and pressed them together around the canteen. Sip, he said. Then breathe. That's all you got to do right now. She drank, small, careful, trembling sips. When she finished, he capped the canteen and stood scanning the horizon again. A low wind had started to stir from the west, carrying a faint hiss. The light shifted, strange and dull. Colt's stomach tightened. Storm's coming. Rebecca blinked, confused. Storm? Sandstorm, he said, already moving. We need shelter now. The wind picked up fast. By the time he helped her back onto the horse, the air had turned to haze. Dust swept around them, stinging eyes and skin. The horizon disappeared behind a curtain of red and gold. It wasn't just wind anymore, it was a living thing roaring through the land with teeth made of sand. Keep your head down, Colt shouted. The storm hit like a wall. Wind howled. Sand lashed. The world shrank to a blur of pain and noise. Ransom pushed forward against it, muscles straining, nostrils flaring. Colt leaned low, shielding Rebecca with his body, one arm holding the reins, the other gripping her close. They stumbled upon salvation by luck more than sight. A rock outcrop, half-buried and mean-looking, but solid enough to break the wind. Colt guided the horse behind it, dismounted, and pulled Rebecca down after him. Together they crouched in the narrow lee of stone while the desert raged around them. She pressed close, trembling. Her hair whipped across her face, dust mixing with tears. Colt tore a strip from his shirt and tied it around her mouth and nose. Breathe through this, he yelled over the roar. For what felt like hours, the storm screamed. Sand-battered rock hissed through cracks piled around their legs. The sky vanished, replaced by a red-brown hell of motion. Time lost meaning. Only breath, grit, and heartbeat remained. Then, as suddenly as it began, the wind faltered. The roar became a whisper. The desert exhaled. When Colt finally lifted his head, the world was transformed. The landscape lay half-buried, reshaped by the storm. The sun fought through the dusty haze, a weak amber coin in a bruised sky. Rebecca was slumped against him, her body trembling with fatigue. Her face was streaked with grime, her lips cracked, but her eyes, when she opened them, still burned with life. It's over, she rasped. For now, Colt said, brushing sand from her hair. You did good, I thought. I thought we'd die. He gave a faint smile. Most storms out here want to make you think that. Trick is not to listen. She let out a weak laugh, half a sob, half a sound of disbelief. You make it sound easy. It ain't, he said. But we're still breathing, and that counts for something. He helped her to her feet. Ransom stood nearby, shaking sand from his coat, eyes wide but unbroken. Colt checked the canteen, still half full. They'd lost no water. That was a miracle in itself. As the wind died entirely, the desert fell silent again. The air smelled of dust and raw heat. Every sound felt heavy, suspended in the stillness. Rebecca turned toward him. You could have left me, she said softly. When the storm started, you could have saved yourself. He looked at her, the faintest crease in his brow. Wouldn't sit right with me? Why? Colt hesitated. He wasn't sure himself. Maybe it was the look in her eyes when he found her. The same kind of lost he once saw in his own reflection after the war. Maybe it was something older, buried in a place he didn't visit often. Because you needed someone, he said finally. And maybe I did too. Rebecca held his gaze for a long time. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was something new, something alive. The kind of quiet that came from two people who'd shared the worst and still stood. She smiled faintly. You have a strange way of showing kindness. He adjusted his hat, hiding a smirk. Don't know any other way. They rested there until the heat began to fall again, the light turning soft and amber. When they finally mounted up and turned north, the land seemed different. Still empty, still cruel, but no longer endless. They rode side by side this time, the wind gentle at their backs. Every few minutes, Rebecca would glance over, as if to make sure he was still there. Each time he was. The desert had tried to break them. Instead, it had welded them together quietly, invisibly, like steel forged in sand and sun. Morning came slow, pale, and merciful. The storm had scoured the sky clean, leaving a crisp stillness that made every sound ring sharp. The creak of saddle leather, the steady rhythm of Ransom's hooves, the faint rustle of Rebecca's torn dress as it brushed against Colt's coat. They had been riding for hours when the first sign appeared, a faint line of smoke curling against the horizon. Civilization, Stillwater. To most, it was a nowhere town built around a half-dry river, a saloon and a promise that never quite paid out. To Rebecca Mays, it looked like salvation painted in dust. She squinted toward it, her face half hidden by the brim of Colt's spare hat. "Is that it?" she asked, voice cracked but steady. "That's it," Colt said. "Stillwater." She let out a trembling breath, part relief, part disbelief. "I never thought I'd see people again." "Don't count on much more than that," he replied. "Town's small and the law's smaller, but there's shade, water, and a roof. That sounds like heaven to me." They rode the last miles in silence. The land softened, the harsh dunes giving way to patches of brush and the broken remains of old fence lines. A crow circled above, its cry cutting through the quiet like a warning. By noon they reached the outskirts, a handful of shacks, a watering trough, a church with a leaning steeple. The town itself sat like a tired animal beneath the sun, alive but barely breathing. Dust devils danced in the street. Colt pulled Ransom to a stop near the trough. Rebecca slid down carefully, her legs stiff and unsteady. She looked at the water, muddy, warm, but she smiled anyway. It was still water. "Go on," Colt said, nodding. "Drink, wash up." "You earned it." She knelt, cupped the water in her hands, and splashed her face. The sensation made her gasp. It was the first clean feeling she'd known in days. When she looked up, Colt was standing a few steps away, watching the street. His hand rested near the butt of his revolver, out of habit, not fear. "Do you think he's here?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. "Could be. Could have headed east, maybe south. A man who runs once tends to keep running." She lowered her eyes. "If you saw him, what would you do?" He studied her for a long moment. "What do you want me to do?" Her throat tightened. "I don't know. I thought I wanted justice. Maybe I just want to stop feeling like I'm waiting for it." Colt nodded slowly. "That's about the truest thing I've heard in a long while." They walked together toward the small main street. A few locals watched them pass, faces hidden behind dust and suspicion. A woman in an apron stood in a doorway, a bucket in hand. A boy stared from behind a hitching post. To them, Rebecca must have looked like a ghost, her tattered gown trailing behind her, hair wild, skin browned by the desert sun. They reached the saloon, a two-story shack with faded paint and the name Dunlap's Crossing barely legible above the door. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with tobacco smoke and the sweet-sour smell of whiskey. A few heads turned. Most went back to their glasses. Colt tipped his hat to the barkeep. "Need 2 waters, 1 room for the lady." The barkeep, a man with eyes like dull coins, nodded. "Backstairs. Room 2. Rebecca's fingers brushed Colt's sleeve. "You're not staying?" He looked at her gently. "I'll be around. Just not under a roof. Don't sleep well with walls." She tried to smile. "I can't imagine sleeping at all." "Try," he said. "You'll need it." He helped her up the narrow stairs. The room was small but clean enough. Bed, basin, single window looking out over the endless land. She turned toward him, uncertain. "I don't have money," she said softly. "I didn't ask for any." "Then why?" He cut her off with a faint shake of the head. "You don't owe me, Mrs. Mays, not a thing." Something in her expression faltered, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "You saved me." He hesitated, then met her gaze. "You saved yourself. I just happened to be there." They stood in silence for a moment that felt too long and too short all at once. Finally, he nodded toward the bed. "Rest. I'll check on you come morning." She wanted to speak, to say something that could reach the quiet place between them. But the words never found shape. She just nodded. Colt left the room, closing the door softly behind him. He spent the afternoon in the shade behind the saloon, cleaning his revolver and watching the road. Riders came and went, miners, drifters, freight wagons. None matched the face he remembered from her story. Still, his eyes stayed sharp. When the sun fell, he went inside for a drink. The piano was broken, but a man still tried to play. The tune was wrong, but it fit the place. Colt nursed his whiskey until the room thinned out. Upstairs, Rebecca woke to the sound of distant laughter. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memories returned. The carriage, the desert, the man who didn't leave her behind. She rose, crossed to the window, and saw Colt below, standing in the orange lamplight, his shadow long across the dust. She pressed her hand to the glass. He looked up just once and tipped his hat. She smiled through the blur of exhaustion. The morning light slanted through the window like a slow-moving river of gold, catching the dust in soft motion. Rebecca woke to its warmth, blinking against it, the faint ache of exhaustion settling into her bones. The bed was small, the room bare, but it felt safe. The kind of safety that doesn't come from walls, but from knowing you're not alone in the world anymore. Downstairs, the saloon was already stirring. Men's voices, clinking bottles, boots against the floorboards. Through the thin wall she heard a hoarse whinny, then the steady, patient tread she now recognized as Ransom's. There was a knock at her door. When she opened it, Colt stood there, hat in hand. The morning sun behind him gave him a silhouette of quiet strength. His coat was dusted from travel, his eyes calm but distant, the look of a man halfway between leaving and staying. "Morning," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "Morning. You're leaving," he nodded once. "Figured I'd head out before the heat starts." She hesitated, fingers tracing the edge of the doorframe.
"Where will you go?"
Colt looked past her toward the open window. The desert stretched beyond the town, flat and shimmering. "Back home," he said finally. "What's left of it? Home? Old place up north. Used to be my family's ranch. Been empty near 10 years now. House is probably half fallen by now. Thought I might try to fix it. Maybe put a roof back over the memories. See if there's still any life left in it, or in me." His voice wasn't sad, just steady, like he was speaking a truth he'd carried too long to hide anymore. Rebecca stepped closer, and after that, he shrugged lightly. "Don't know. Maybe I stay. Maybe I don't. Guess I'll find out once I get there." For a moment, the only sound between them was the soft wind through the hallway and the distant cry of a crow. She looked at him then, not as the man who'd saved her, but as the one who'd taught her how to stand again. Something inside her ached at the thought of him riding off into the emptiness, the same loneliness that had nearly swallowed her days ago. "Colt," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I asked to go with you, would you let me?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Go with me?" She nodded, eyes steady now. "To help if you'll have it. You said the house needs fixing. I can cook, mend, keep things in order, just until I decide what to do with my life." He studied her face, searching for the reason behind the words. "You sure that's what you want? It's hard country up there, quiet, lonely." She smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered. "I've already met lonely, Mr. Avery. I don't much care for it." He looked down, thumb brushing the brim of his hat, then back up at her. "You don't owe me anything, Rebecca." "I know," she said softly. "That's why I want to come." Her words hung in the air, simple, honest, unadorned. But her eyes said more than her voice ever could. They said she wasn't looking for a place to rest. She'd already found one. Colt exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right. If you're sure?" "I am." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Best saddle up then." "Day's wasting," she smiled, small, radiant, real, and went to gather her few belongings. When she returned, the saloon's noise had faded behind them, and the dusty main street glowed under the morning sun. Ransom stood waiting, calm as ever. Colt mounted first, then offered his hand. She took it without hesitation. Her grip was firm, her smile steady. "Never thought I'd ride anywhere again," she said, settling behind him. "Then let's start with somewhere worth it," he said. They rode out of Stillwater, slow and quiet, the town shrinking behind them until it was just another dot swallowed by the horizon. The sun rose higher, bathing the world in gold. Ahead, the open land stretched forever, empty, wild, and full of promise. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Rebecca leaned slightly closer, her voice soft but sure. "Colt, yeah? When you said you were going home, maybe that's not just a place," he didn't answer. But his hand brushed hers for a brief moment, a quiet acknowledgement, a promise without words. The trail wound through sagebrush and pale stone, the air warm and clean. Ransom's hooves made the only rhythm in the silence, steady and sure, carrying them toward a life neither had expected, but both had been searching for. By the time the sun began to dip, the horizon ahead glowed with a softer light, the kind that feels like forgiveness. Colt looked at the road, at the faint line where land met sky, and felt something inside ease for the first time in years. Beside him, Rebecca turned her head and smiled, not at him, not at the view, but at the quiet certainty that somehow, against all odds, they were exactly where they were meant to be.